Greetings, friends. Operational situation at the front on the 9th of April. We have a lot of news on the front today, and the news background, and we will start with you from the Lemensky section of the front. Fighting continues east of Tarnovo, as well as eastern Yampilovka, both in the area of the Krugaya Beam and in the area of the Laptev Yar. It cannot be said that after the last attacks, after it was possible to repel most of the attacks and even for the trophy tank, that the enemy abandoned their plans to carry out assault operations, because activity is again visible on this sector of the front, and again they are trying to pull up equipment with a CRA. That is, the path we actually have is a vector in the direction of the Thorns, in order to continue the assault operations again. Therefore, so far, we have not recorded any changes, except that the enemy is again pulling up equipment and is preparing to resume assault operations in the near future. As for Bologorovka, we have been speaking for it for the last few days, saying that the enemy's assault actions are being carried out on this sector of the front. We recorded a lot of attacks, analyzed it from drone footage, as you remember. To date, there are also fresh shots of battles already, which means that along a small forest belt, but already behind the chalk quarry's grillstone itself, footage was published from the AFU, where they drop a drone drop on enemy infantry, which means they are working out, but it's as if you see that the slope of the chalk quarry's grillstone, and actually on it the enemy forces have already climbed. So far, a gray zone has been added, because there is no information, or rather the gray zone has been adjusted, because there is no information whether they managed to gain a foothold. But this is the third video from this area. In my Telegram, I just published all 3 coordinate points in Bologorovka, and in general, the enemy has been present in this area for a week. If there is already a 4th video, then yes, they are most likely fixed, because there is also the concept of a time interval. This could all happen in one day, when the first attack was repelled. Well, in general, the situation remains under clarification. But here, we see that in any case, the enemy, based on the shots that were published by the APU, the enemy sets as a goal, specifically the capture of the chalk quarry, the main dominant height, while pressing not only from the pumping station area in the western-southwestern direction, but also those attacks from the south, which were, including in the direction of Zolotarevsky Forest, when it was possible to reflect, but we corrected the situation. Here, the enemy is pressing at the same time, also in the north direction, in the direction of the landfill. So most likely in the near future, he will only increase the pressure, based on the visual information that we see today. We turn to the clock direction. Here, of course, we will start with Bogdanovka. The situation has been adjusted, it has been adjusted. But in any case, it was a promotion. So, yesterday we talked to you, and added a gray zone. The enemy attacked, as you remember, passing along the railway into the deciduous forest, and the southern part of Bogdanovka. And unfortunately, we were talking to you then whether it would be possible to gain a foothold, and we will see for 48 hours. But unfortunately, we already see an objective picture today, and he managed to gain a foothold in the southern part of Bogdanovka, take positions, gain a foothold in the deciduous forest and a small landing ledge, about which we said that there will also be attempts to gain a foothold from the enemy. And also, along the forest belt, which we have going from Bogdanovka to the railway, to the station, I don't remember its name. Not Velyanovka, but it's not important. The situation for yesterday, the situation for today. Here, on a front section up to 1 and 6 kilometers wide, they advanced to a depth of 750 meters. Serious promotion, in fact, very serious. Reports continue to arrive today that the fighting is going in the direction of the central part, but they are already attacking not only from the east, northeast, but also from the southwest in a northerly direction. That is, the enemy is putting the main efforts now to take Bogdanovka and then pull up forces into it, which will be larger than those that we have hooked and secured along the railway, and continue the assault actions in the direction of both Kalinovka and the railway, which we have north of the city. There are canals in the Yar district. And of course, the pressure on the deciduous forest will increase, as we talked about yesterday, taking into account the attack that we saw from drone footage on Bogdanovka. It is clear here that the enemy's main goal is no longer so much a deciduous forest as a parallel deciduous forest and Bogdanovka, that is, pulling up forces for a more serious Sturmasiv Yar. This is the situation we have in this sector of the front, on the northern flank of the Chasseur. Speaking for the southern flank, we said that the pressure was Golyubovsky's actions, but then there was information that, in general, they were trying to gain a foothold in its northern part, but in fact it turned out that they managed to advance in the southern part as well. Here, on a front section up to 1 kilometer wide, to a depth of 133 kilometers, the enemy's advances made up, in general, quite a lot. A lot we can say so. And here, if before we considered the nature reserve, the Golyubovsky II mortar reserve, as a flank, in order to attack an hour a yard, now based on the visual information that we have today, we see that in general, there will be attempts not only to go for an hour in the Yar here, and they will definitely take assault actions of Ivanovsky. Only from the north, even I would say from the northwest, they can take it. There are two small forest belts to the Ivanovo forest. But this is a separate point, we will sort it out. In fact, now we can state that the situation in Ivanovo is deteriorating, although there is still a supply road through the Ivanovo forest. As we see. In other words, we talked with you that the enemy would make attempts to advance in the area of Mount Baba 2 weeks ago, so in order to take a section of the T050 for road under fire control, in order to worsen logistics. But then we were sorting out positions in about this area, and now we see that, yes, he managed to take part of the road section under fire control, and now the main supply is already going through the Ivanovo forest. Therefore, this is the situation we have. As for the Golyubovsky II mortar reserve, here we can state, before the enemy advances in its northern part, northeastern, to the central part. And accordingly, further attempts and assault actions will now be aimed at securing a foothold along one of the forest belts, where there are two strongholds of the Nile, and subsequently attempt to storm the Sentinel Yar, the new canal area, the canal area. So from the south, but we will look at the situation, because now it's difficult about to say anything, because the main assault actions are not Chasovo Yara, namely Bogdanovky Stupki Golyubovsky II I undertake. That is, they want to have stronger positions on the flanks. At the same time, this is fraught with consequences for Ivanovsky. Well, in general, this is the situation we have in the area, and in the direction of the Sentry Yar. It is worth adding that yesterday the footage was published, today our Telegram channels also published them. Strikes on the Clock Yar, the city in the Yar with aerial bombs, and not one, not two, not three, but there they drop 5, 7. That's a lot. That is, to destroy the building as much as possible. That is, the enemy just having experience in this sector of the front for Bakhmut. He understands that demolishing buildings is then with artillery, that is, it was a long time. A long period is necessary. This is the first moment. The second point is the huge consumption of artillery shells, heavy artillery. Now he has his advantage in tactical aviation, in the air, and accordingly he uses it in the form of an airbase, which naturally will allow, when the enemy approaches, when the fighting begins for an hour in the Yar, it will allow him to have those advantages that the Wagner PMCs did not have at the time, in the battle for Bakhmut. Very much now for hours, Yar. I'll just take a minute and move on, because there is a lot of news for hours, Yar. I watch a lot of our military right now, who comment on this city, that there will be very heavy battles for it, because this is what we talked about, the dominant height. And I looked at one of the military, gave a really correct comment. I told you that this is the dominant height, which will allow you to put pressure on Konstantinovka. The outfit is still there. It is clear that they will try first of all to close the Kurdyumovka-Ivanovskaya section along the Seversky Donets-Donbass Canal. But there he says, the situation is such that this dominant height, it will allow him to consider the entire area in general, where to advance further. It will not only be Konstantinovka, it may also be, well, in general, attempts of Georgiivka, that is, due to the dominant, absolutely dominant height in this entire area. It allows him to increase pressure on the same Orekhovo-Vasilyevka, which was stormed already beyond the Mayskaya Canal, and so on and so on. That is, in fact, the enemy will have a very serious advantageous tactical position, despite the fact that he has dominance in personnel, and accordingly, in aviation. But the most important thing here is aviation. Therefore, it may not be Konstantinovka, there may be anything here, including up to Konstantinovka. We have a Turetsky direction, which has remained unchanged since the first day of the war. In fact, there were minimal changes on maybe 5 to 10 meters. He may try to level the front line, due to this height, but we will look at this further. We turn to the Avdiivsky direction, to Novokalinev. Another gray area has been added. We said yesterday that there were shelling, so the landings in this area were also recorded shelling of the forest belt, which is already going east from the landing of this one. In general, here it is a ledge. And a gray area has also been added here. There are no specifics yet. Why? Because there are heavy battles going on. Here, the situation is dynamic, and we saw in the gray zone both the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine, which we commented on yesterday, and the positions of the enemy. In other words, there are very heavy battles going on. But here it is also worth adding that the enemy was not a one-time attack, as we initially said for the Fur Yard in the southern, southeastern part of Novokalinev. When they carried out the attack, and whether they managed to knock it out, they left it for clarification. We see that they are pulling forces to this sector of the front, in general, conducting attacks. Whether it will be possible to stabilize the situation, I think it will be seen here, within 48 hours. So far, there are fights going on. The Berdik area had several attacks, as in Semenovka, it was possible to repel, so there are no changes here. I would even say that it is possible to stop the enemy approximately in the area between the Farts and with the typical, and in the eastern part of the Berdik, that is, not even to the center anymore. And armored vehicles are extremely important to the infantry, but now, of course, all measures are being taken by the FUI to prevent it, because here then the enemy completely, taking two settlements Semenovka and Berdik, let's say, leaves a huge space, in the form of an open field, where he can work with aerial bombs without even going to assault actions in the western, northwestern, southwestern direction, but just leave it for a certain period, gain a foothold and, accordingly, rotate the forces that were involved in this sector of the front. Therefore, he sets a very big goal, but of course, counterattacks are also visible from our side. No changes. As for the thin Yasnobrodovka section, all attacks were repulsed here, we do not record any changes. In other words, everything remained within the red zone. The only thing I'm going to comment on here is one point. In the gray zone, it means there was an attempt to advance, but not in the western direction, which means from the site where they control part of the forest belt in the southern direction to the intersection. There was an attempt, they retreated to their original positions. In other words, based on what we have seen over the past 40 hours, there is an attempt to reach another abandoned field reservoir, or more simply, another support point from two directions. So far, without any changes. Today, there was information from the enemy military commissars that they completely managed to capture the village of Pervomeyskaya. It means that we do not have visual confirmation of this information, as well as a lot of throw-ins that were at one time for Ivanovsko, for Nevelskaya too, which we have to the south and is still attributed by the enemy in the red zone. Therefore, we are waiting for more information, but unfortunately, it must be said here that yes, there were assault actions within the gray zone, because the last shots that were published from May Day, they showed that the enemy was trying to work along several streets in the north direction. And taking into account the fact that they work here mainly at night, as if we don't have any new information that we didn't have at night, I mean visual. But the fact that they made attempts to enter the gray zone is really true. Whether they managed, as the enemy reports, to fully reach the end of the May Day, I have my doubts, of course. If there is an advance, it is possible, taking into account the current situation, but not the western part, because according to preliminary information, there were attacks, but they managed to repel. Therefore, the situation here remains to be clarified. Now we turn to the city of Krasnogorovka. Yesterday, we briefly talked. Today we will and added a gray zone. Today, we will talk in more detail about this sector of the front. So we have visual information. There is a georeference to the terrain of drone frames. And that means the first moment. An assault armored group consisting of 8 armored vehicles advanced from Stara Mikhailovka. Later there were 4 more units. Later there were 3 more armored vehicles carried out assault operations. There was just the same turtle tank involved, about which there is a lot of talk. After the broadcast, I will also have a small comment in the telegram about this with the same turtle tank, completely sheathed with metal sheets. Unfortunately, as they wrote in the Insider, as they wrote in Union, and a number of other telegram channels, despite the ingenuity shown by the enemy, yes, they worked out the tank with artillery too, but he remained unharmed and retreated to his original positions as a result. In general, an interesting thing, it is clear that the tower is already deprived of the same rotation, that is, there it can rotate minimally. Well, in general, I'll post it in a telegram, take a look, but the bottom line is that this design works. A very interesting point, but here we say something else. So they moved in the direction of Krasnogorovka, and there were strikes on positions in a high-rise building of one of the buildings, already in Krasnogorovka itself. It is reported that the enemy retreated from Krasnogorovka itself, but it is not reported to their original positions. Or they managed to take up to Krasnogorovka itself. There are 2 supports, they could catch on and gain a foothold for them. Therefore, a gray zone has been added to these 2 strongholds, and the situation remains under clarification. In addition, attacks were made not only from the side of Stary Mikhailovka, that is from the east to the northwest, but also from the south, from the area of the veins of the mine shaft of the Trudovskaya attack. It means that the attacks were stopped approximately in this area, so here the enemy retreated to their original positions. There has already been information that fighting is continuing, but in general, the east-southeast of Krasnogorovka, it is most likely just the same for 2 strong points. Well, we will be closer, as I understand it, to see more objective information by tomorrow, because today, despite the fact that there are a lot of videos, there is a lot of contradictory information. There are places where the enemy retreats to their original positions, but there are also attacks on a high-rise building, I repeat. Therefore, here, we will see the full objective picture for 24 hours. It is natural to say already that this is a distracting character, in any case impossible. No. If then the attacks to the south were really, I would say, distracting in nature, in my opinion, because the wrong forces were involved, then today we see that the enemy is trying to drag and stretch as much as possible the forces on the Avdiivsky, Kurikovsky sectors of the front. That is, stretch the two sections as much as possible, lead to activity, and, accordingly, dissipate forces. That is, a bet on exhaustion, and on their superiority in personnel, as well as in tactical aviation and artillery. It's natural. In other words, in fact, we see the greatest activity here, as the Charles direction is also called, because, well, Kurakhovskaya, Karlovskaya, Avdiivskaya are working in the direction of Karlovka. Here we have three areas where the enemy is trying to get as active as possible, to show their activity as much as possible. But here, it is worth noting the work of the Apu drone fighters, but at the same time, there are changes due to just the same superiority of the enemy. Therefore, this is the situation we have. Moving on. Then, we have Novomikhailovka, the South Donetsk sector of the front. Here, the enemy managed to advance a little more along Timoryozov Street and along Shevchenko Street, to a depth of up to 200 meters of advance. We note the situation for yesterday, the situation for today. As we can see, a lot of attempts are being made north of Novomikhailovka, and the battles continue for the Dacha village of machine builders. Attempts along Centralnaya Street were stopped there and even discarded. Why didn't we mark the red zone where they passed for the first time? It was possible to discard. This is one moment. The second point is that you see, they continue to press. That is, using the numerical superiority again, the enemy is pressing, can afford it, presses north, in and south of Novomikhailovka. We have some activity to the south as well. It has, of course, a positional character now, but it carries just the same strategy of distracting strikes, that is, to disperse as much as possible, including the forces of the Apu drone operators in this sector of the front. Therefore, the fighting in our country for Novomikhailovka continues. But the fighting is really, I will say, very, very heavy, very heavy. More, of course, heavy for the enemy, because the Apu, the first thing they defend. Secondly, drone pilots and artillery mainly work here. But this is already such a moment. Unfortunately, the opponent has partial success. Moving on. Then, we have the Zaporozhye section of the front of Robotin and Verpov. So, we will comment on our work here. There is further information. They carry out a transfer, even let's give it away initially. That's about it. Sweet Beam, Novoprokopovka. The enemy is now transferring additional forces in order to increase the pressure on work, but most likely it will be in the next plus or minus 48 hours because there is no message yet that there is art training or tactical aviation activity on the part of the enemy. So far, this is not the case. So far, there is information only about what is pulling up reserves. But this, of course, is not to just leave them at the front line, at the front edge, where there are regular arrivals. This is natural. In order to increase the pressure at work, most likely they will try to strike from the south and southwest. Well, in general, we will look at the situation. Now we state that the enemy is pulling up forces. As for the work itself, has the situation changed? I would say with varying success. Just like we said yesterday, it is possible to discard somewhere. There were shots from the red zone, including. They are trying to pull up equipment, but now they are not succeeding. There is just the same very effective work on the part of the Apu drone guides in order to prevent the advance and consolidation of the work itself in the southern part. So far, the enemy is attacking there with small infantry groups of 2 and 3 people, that is very small groups, in order to cling to the basements with minimal forces so far, but they are definitely preparing an attack with large forces at work. We will look at this in fact.